I feel like endurance is such a commonly used word that it actually makes it more difficult to truly understand what it means. Like, I think when we use it in a technical sense, we use it more so as an adjective. Like, we just think of it as synonymous with endurance sports. So we think of endurance just like swimming, running, Ironman, cycling. But I want to strip all of that away and get to the root of it. How do you define what endurance is?
Yeah, it is a tough question, and I probably you could ask 10 people and you'd get 10 different answers. Um, the definition that I've been going with, which is credit to a researcher named Samuel Marcora who used it, is it's the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. So it's not like it's not something you can specifically measure in a lab. It's not your VO2 max or anything like that. It is something general, which applies in endurance sports, but I think applies in a lot of other areas of life too.
Yeah, I mean, your life as a whole, it seems like endurance has played a huge component, not just from the physical, with being a runner, but you've had a very diverse three-dimensional life, I would say, focus on running in your early life and then being a physicist and then transitioning into being a writer. I'm curious to know how you see endurance as something like that, not just as the physical, but your entire life, how it's played a
Yeah,
role.
I mean, look, I'm an endurance guy, so I'm biased, but I would say I think endurance plays a key role in everyone's life. Like
Yeah.
you cannot go through life without having to struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop, whether that's in the classroom or in the professional context, or in a personal context, or in a sports context. For me, endurance is definitely like a central thing, and it's I've been a runner for my whole life, so it's part of my identity that I'm able to keep struggling to continue against that mounting desire to stop. And so that it's definitely something that um, when I'm approaching or when I have approached challenges in other areas of my life, if it's like, okay, I've decided to reinvent myself, I'm leaving physics, I'm going to become a journalist, this is going to be a long and arduous road. I'm like, that's okay, it's good, I'm good at long and arduous roads. I know that because as a runner, it's not just like in a race you have to endure uh, for 4 minutes or for 2 hours or whatever the length of the race is. Training for endurance is a real um, endurance challenge, in the sense that you're saying, I'm going to spend the next 2 years of my life, and I'm going to every day I'm going to put in the work, and I'm going to be tired on 363 out of every 365 days of the year, and I'm going to hopefully judge it so that I'm feeling great on the 2 days when my most important races are, or whatever. So anyway, this idea of being able to play the long game, of persisting through challenge, um, running, it gives me confidence that, oh, if I'm going to now set out on a new journey as a journalist, let's say, that I'm going to be able to do it. I'm going to be able to push through it. I've definitely sort of taken that as kind of my mantra for challenges, both in and out of sport.
When it comes to understanding the physical compared to the mental with endurance, how do we navigate that when we're appreciating the mind and body as a unified entity versus two separate things?
Yeah, it's definitely the I mean the underlying question that I think motivated or got me interested in the research that I wrote about in Endure is like, you know, when I finish a race and I'm like, I went as hard as I could, how much of that limit is dictated by mind and how much is my body? And um, you could say, first of all, you're never going to get a perfect answer to that question. Second of all, like as you're sort of suggesting, the question is not well posed, because my mind is part of my body. You can't like, where do you draw the line between mind and body? Is if you're experiencing central fatigue, if nerve signals back to your brain are convincing your brain to down regulate your muscles, is that your mind or is that your body? So look, it's impossible to answer that question, except that, or which doesn't mean that I don't try. And there was a study, I don't know, must have been 5 or 6 years ago now, which I'm trying, I can't remember the exact details, but I think it was like a cycling study. They put people through a bunch of physical tests and a bunch of psychological tests, and then had them do an endurance task. And it's like, okay, which of these parameters predict performance best? And so with that particular construct, they were able to come. It's like it's 69% physical and 31% mental, and of course that's the numbers aren't really that precise, and so it depends how you frame the question. But if I had to like if there's a message that I think is important to take away, it's that um, they both matter, and that we often, certainly again, running is my metaphor for everything. If you're running a race, if you put me on a treadmill and dial up the speed to some quick pace or whatever, and then say, Alex, run until you fall off the back. When I fall off the back, I'll be like, man, I was trying, and you offer me like, $1,000 for every minute I stay on. So I'm really, really trying hard. And eventually I fall off the back and I'm like, oh man, I wish I could have stayed on for another minute to get another $1,000, but I just couldn't. My legs couldn't do it. I was breathing too hard. I was just at my limits. That is almost always an illusion. If it was $1,000,000 instead of $1,000, my legs probably would have been able to do it.
I like that idea, and you write about it in your book a little. You say, after all, the brain is part of the body. And it's kind of a rhetorical question, another tough question to ask. But why don't we see it that way?
Yeah, well, that is like, the philosophy of the last 5,000 years, trying to
Yeah.
understand, the duality of mind and body. Um, so a couple things. One is that physical sensations feel very real and measurable. And so certainly in the context of endurance, it's like, if I'm trying to lift up a weight and I can't lift up a weight, it's not like I don't want to lift. It doesn't feel like I'm deciding not to lift up the weight. So there's a lot of there's a lot going on in our minds that we don't have access to, or in our brains, let's say. So we have the illusion that we're these rational creatures that are every time I move, I'm like, I am going to decide to move my hand over towards this cup so that I can drink some water. But in reality, there's it's like the iceberg where most of the action is going on underneath the surface. So I think we're unaware in a lot of cases of what our minds are doing, and so that helps to give us the illusion that, oh, there's this separate thing called my body that I just control by thinking about it. Whereas in reality, you can do the whole, in psychology, not just in sports science, but in psychology, there's various studies you can do that people do that show all the calculations that are going on under the surface in your mind that dictate how your body reacts to a given stimulus. So I don't know, that's not a good answer because it's a very hard thing to answer.
Yeah. I mean, it was a
but
tough question. So.
yeah, no, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and so we can talk about this and we can say, look, Tim, we all know that the mind is part of the body. But no matter how often I say that, it doesn't change my subjective experience that there's a little man inside my head that's making decisions, and that's separate from this machinery of my muscles. It still feels that way no matter how much I tell myself that it's not.
Getting deeper into the mental, is there any further context or research that you can share about the conscious versus unconscious mind when it comes to endurance?
Yeah, I mean, the first caveat I should say is that I am not a psychologist or a neuroscience scientist, and so that whole concept of conscious versus unconscious, when you talk to psychologists or to brain scientists or cognitive scientists, they bristle. Like it feels like every scientist I've spoken to has a different definition of like, is this true? Can we talk about conscious versus unconscious? Is this really more like Daniel Kahneman's system 1 versus system 2? There's all these different ways of talking about the different types of processing that we do, the different ways we react, the different ways our minds work. So what I would say in terms of what more we can say about that is that what Freud thought 100 years ago is not the current thinking. It's not like I have repressed dreams from my childhood, and when I try and run a race, really what I'm trying to do is make up for the fact that my potty training didn't go well or whatever. It's this distinction between conscious and unconscious is much more nebulous. And I guess, look, and I will say again, not not being a brain scientist at the forefront of brain science, I'm not confident of this, but I feel like it's much harder to make a distinction between conscious and unconscious than we might assume. That it's not this bright line, that there's this sort of continuum. Things are going on deep down below, like we're our bodies are constantly sensing like the temperature, let's say, or hunger, and there's things that we kind of are semi-aware of, and then there's this sort of frontal lobe where we're fully aware and trying to exert control. But yeah, so that's a waffly answer, but um, I think the key thing to understand is that it's not as simple as we have an ego and an id and a superego or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think when I was reading your book, I was also looking at it from the context or just another rhetorical question or hypothesis that I had. I was like, oh, it's interesting. Like within my unconscious mind, is it any way possible that maybe there's some type of reserved energy store within my unconscious mind that I'm not really able to access, but potentially I could some way?
Yeah, and I think I think that's a really sort of powerful idea, and again, it's that idea that when you reach your limits, actually there is more if you can tap into your unconscious. I think that's true. I think that's true. And I think that that to me is one of the sort of the most exciting areas of inquiry in, let's say, the last 10 or 15 years of sports science. Um, it's more a question of like, what words do we use to describe that? So I think those words that I understand and you understand, and hopefully listeners understand, that there's that unconsciously, where let's say the brain is protecting you, the brain is saying
Mm.
you don't want to, you think you want to run out of energy, but you don't want to run out of energy because that's going to be really ugly and put you in danger. Um, I think in broad strokes that's true. Um, but when you try and say, okay, well, let's see, where is this unconscious, or how does this unconscious work? Then you find it becomes much harder to the words we use start to get difficult to define. But I think in practice, uh, it's true that we can unlock some of this hidden reserves. And so like a very simple example is you do some endurance task all out, and there are lots of studies showing that if you're not fully fueled, let's say you wake up in the morning and you go do a 1 hour hard run, that if you then towards the end of that run take some sports drink, swish it in your mouth, and spit it out. So you haven't even changed the fuel, and it's not that you've given yourself more fuel. You've just signaled to your brain that you're sending more fuel. Then you can go faster. And this is not a decision, because let's assume you're maximally motivated in both cases. This is clearly something that's going on at an unconscious level, where your brain is then deciding, oh, there's fuel on the way, so we can, we can release more fuel to the muscles. And the next twist of that is you can do the same thing with artificially sweetened drinks, and it doesn't work. So this is not just a question of you're tasting sugar and it's telling you, fuel's on the way, because you can have that same taste, you can be unable to distinguish it, but it doesn't work if there's no actual fuel, no carbohydrate, no sugar in the drink. So there's a lot of studies like this where you find ways of manipulating the environment, and all of a sudden it doesn't feel harder to you, but you're able to go faster or push harder. So clearly there's a hidden reserve. We have many ways, including just psychology, just like self-talk, things like that, just changing the inner narrative that can help access this reserve. But it remains where that reserve is, like how it's regulated, is still mostly a mystery.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, for you personally, what was the transition like from going very numbers calculation based to simply just viewing your body as a machine to having this more nuanced perceptive view on things and having a greater appreciation for the fluidity of your body, especially when it comes to endurance?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's very much still a work in progress. So I look at some context. So I wrote the book Endure that came out in 2018, and I spent 9 or 10 years researching it. So I had a lot of time to marinate in the ideas about the brain's role in endurance. The book came out, and I was giving talks about it in various places. And at one talk, um, someone stuck up their hand and asked about the last line in the book, which is something about along the lines of like, you know, it turns out that there really is, we really do have more to give. There really is more in there if we can come to believe, if you can come to believe it. And when I wrote that, I was kind of, what I meant is self-belief is really important. That one of the most powerful ways of unlocking the reserve is to believe that it's there. But this person in the audience had read it as if you can come to believe it, that I didn't really quite believe it yet myself, that I was still the very numbers based sort of, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist guy that I was during my athletic career when I was younger. And I thought about that, and I was like, well, that's not what I meant when I wrote it, but it's probably one of those, here we go, unconscious, almost Freudian phrasings where it's like, yeah, it is true. I still have trouble believing it. And, in my own life, so I wrote this book all about how self-talk is great and, maybe mindfulness training, and people are like, so what has your experience been with mindfulness training? I was like, well, I still haven't actually done it. So it's like the when I was a kid, there were these GI Joe public service announcements where, like, don't stick your fork in the toaster or whatever. And the kid would say, or the GI Joe at the end would say, now, and knowing is half the battle. And that's a sort of a reminder to myself that I can intellectually know that there is more to endurance than VO2 max, and that my thoughts and my emotions and my feelings play an important role. I believe that intellectually, but I still struggle with it because my whole perspective on life is built around just very concrete, measurable things. So yeah, it's an ongoing dialogue in my head, I guess.
I mean, does that feel like a double-edged sword at times, or do you feel like that's a huge benefit of yours because it allows you to continue to push forward in your work and always be curious?
Yeah, it's interesting. So let me answer that within in a sort of sideways way, which is that I would so in the context of running was the most important thing in my life, through my 20s, and so I was trying to do everything I could to shave off a tenth of a second. So now, like, I turned 50 this year. I still run, I still train, I still race, I still compete, but it's not like I'm not super stressed about that. I like to go out and compete and see what I'm capable of, but I don't really care if I'm a second faster or slower, because for one thing, I'm always slower, every time I go. So in a sense, the fact that I haven't done these things isn't as sort of hypocritical as it might seem at first, because I'm just like, there's lots of things I don't do now because I'm not like, I don't train 100 miles a week because I'm just like, I have a career and I have kids and I have a family, and so I fit running into the box that's available. And so I think one misnomer or one misapprehension is that, oh, you can get faster just by believing different things. Well, that's super easy. You should just believe different things, but it's like, no, doing that takes effort and work and time to do that. You call it inner work. It's not a freebie. Doing mindfulness training or motivational self-talk, all these things take effort. So I would say I haven't done the bigger reason that I haven't sort of gone deep on them is not that I'm too skeptical to believe them. It's that I'm too lazy or busy, depending on how you want to phrase it. But I do think, your question was like, does this kind of hold me back or help drive me forward in terms of maintaining curiosity? I think there's a little bit of staying skeptical, so sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, but I'll give another context. I write a lot about things like sports supplements or sports technology, fancy watches that measure HRV. which are very, very popular among endurance athletes. And I'll write about the evidence for what they do or what they don't do. I don't have a GPS watch. I don't take any supplements. I don't try. Like I've written tons about this company called Morton that has a hydrogel sports drink and a very special formulation of baking soda. It's like the hottest thing in endurance sports. I've written some very big articles on those topics. I've never tried any of them. And so something that I think is a strength for me personally, for the kind of journalism I like to do, is that I am not writing about my personal journey. I am not writing about my experiences, whether I liked the flavor of that sports drink, or whether self-talk worked for me. I'm writing about what the evidence shows. So there is an advantage, I think, a little bit in just staying outside the fray, not being the 100th person on the internet writing about their personal journey with this stuff, but being someone who is interested in it, who cares about the outcomes, who finds the topic fascinating, but is standing outside the field and writing about it. It's still, I still feel a little funny sometimes where it's like, yeah, I'm writing my 11th article about this, and I still haven't actually tried it. So
No, I really like that. And it seems like within your life and your personal journey, I think I would say the way that I view it is okay, yeah, I'm not writing about my personal journey, but my personal journey was the launching pad for me to be able to get to this point, and now I'm going to build off of that. Um, and I do want to talk about your personal journey a little bit more because I find it really, really fascinating. And like you said, running was the most important thing up until your late 20s, to the point of something that I heard you say, to the point of your brother changing his wedding for a track meet of yours. Um,
I still feel bad about that because I ran like crap. But yeah, like I look back and I'm like, how the hell did I have the nerve to ask him to do that? Um, when you're in the middle of it, sometimes that's maybe not the greatest example of like sports as a part of a healthy life. But yeah,
yeah.
it was what I lived for.
Yeah. I mean, how young were you when that obsession really started to take place in your life?
I guess I started training seriously. I mean, I'd sort of identified as a runner, as someone who liked to race since I was, since kindergarten or whatever. But I was 15 when I started training seriously, and I had some immediate success in my first year or two, first year of running, of training seriously, or first year and a half. That then kind of got me hooked, made me believe that I could be, reach the top levels or whatever. And I got pretty serious from right from that point on. And I guess by the end of, I had some mediocre years for a while, and then it was one of those things where in my last year of university, and a lot of people who train seriously in a sport like running, which is not like there aren't a lot of doors that open thanks to running, beyond college. So a lot of people would quit at the end of college, and maybe that would have happened to me, except that I had a sort of big breakthrough actually starting in my third year of college. But then in my last year of college, I leveled up, and the summer after I graduated, I made my first national team for Canada. And so that then was like, oh, now I'm really playing in, if not the big leagues, then, the relatively big leagues from my perspective. And I got injured the next year and missed the next couple of years. So then I felt like I had unfinished business. And so in other words, there were a series of things that each of which served to kind of draw me on for another couple of years to say, well, I can't walk away until I find out how good I can be, or I can't walk away without knowing if I can come back from this injury and get back to that level or to the next level. So, but yeah, like basically from about 15 to 28, that would have been my era of, running first, everything else a distant second.
What was it like coming out of that obsession when you were 28 and you knew it was like, okay, I have the rest of my life in front of me here?
Yeah, I mean, it was, big feelings and lots of uncertainty. So a few things came together. One is that was 2004, and so I was preparing for that summer's Olympic trials, and I got a stress fracture in my back, in my sacrum, about 3 months before the trials. So I was able to run in the trials, but I'd only been, able to run on dry land for a few weeks before the trials. Um, so that helped in the sense that, had I, let's say I had been healthy and gone and come fourth at the trials or something like that, and not achieved all my dreams, but it might have been enough to make me think, well, maybe it's worth re-upping for one more cycle. Um, the stress factor was, it meant I missed the whole season, and I had really struggled with injuries before that too. So there was a sense of natural closure there. And then that also, I had that coincide with, that's when I at the time I was a postdoctoral researcher in physics. I had applied to journalism school. And so right after the Olympic trials, I had 1 month, and then I left my job as a physicist and started as a journalist. So there was a lot of reinvention. Um, Launching into journalism, I think, was the way I coped with, here's who I was for 10 or 13 years or whatever it was. Here's where I poured my passions into it. I'm starting something brand new where first of all, it's going to be hard. It's journalism then, just as now, was not an easy career to go forward in. But it also had some excitement that for me had kind of leaked out of physics. I no longer was super passionate about it. Journalism was new and fresh. And so I was able to kind of transfer my dreams a little bit. Not to go too deep. There's around that time, my brother, as a sort of joke, because he knew I was thinking of leaving physics, he gave me a book for Christmas, which was someone's PhD thesis from the University of Chicago about physics career trajectories. It talked to physicists from all sort of levels and how they'd progressed and what their hopes and dreams were. And the title of the book was "The Stars Are Not Enough." And one of the points it made was that physics is one of those careers where there's a pantheon, where there's like, I wonder if I could ever be like Albert Einstein or whatever. And there are a lot of careers which are great careers, but which don't carry that same sense of like reaching for something. Like, there are lots of great accountants, and some of my best friends are accountants, but no one's like, I wonder if I could ever be like, Bob the accountant and be, be the fastest with the slide rule or whatever. It's just, it's a job you do rather than a sort of aspirational dream. And so journalism, I think, was a good fit because it had that same sense of like, I wonder if I could ever achieve that, if I could ever be a columnist for Runner's World or something, which was probably my number one dream when I started. So all of which is to say, I was able to transfer. Nonetheless, like I went to journalism school when I was 28. Did a master's. I did my master's thesis was on post-Olympic, when athletes retire and what happens and how they feel. So I was doing a little bit of like meta therapy by talking to a bunch of athletes who'd had different types of transitions after they retired from, and the psychologists that they worked with and the programs. So this was helping me think about some of the challenges that I would face and how important it was to find something else to dream about.
Yeah, that resonates on a deep level. I mean, just a little personal anecdote about me. I feel like when I was much younger, my physical obsession was with working out, like lifting weights, and I feel like I grew out of that obsession, and it was tough for me because it was like, ooh, I'm a very intense person, so to speak. And I was like, but I'm not getting that same intensity, or I'm not getting that same feeling from working out anymore. And then I got into podcasting, and pretty early on I was like, ooh, this feels like a similar feeling that I would get, and a similar intensity and energy that I would get from working out. Is that something that you tapped into, or something that you recognized with writing early on, and did it feel similar to running?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of parallels, and I think, yeah, like I was just saying before, part of it was the sense that there's something that you can be working towards.
Yeah.
There's a perfectibility or a sense of progression, a sense of like, I, maybe I can do, if I keep working, I can do this better. Um, and I think, this is something um, ended up wrestling with a little bit in my last book, The Explorer's Gene, where it's like that feeling that you're alive, that you're pursuing something. It's a super, super like motivating and exciting and satisfying feeling. Eventually, as you get older, you start to think, I wonder if I need to like turn this down at some point, or like, do you always want to be having the feeling that um, the stars are not quite enough, that there's something more. Um, so I've started. I probably have a slightly different perspective on that now than I did when I was 28 and just launching into to journalism. But I think it was absolutely vital for me to have something else I could transfer my passions or my sort of aspirations into, or just my obsessiveness, my intensity, as you're saying, and that worked well. And I think it's very much like what you're finding too, that if you hadn't found something to replace that feeling, you would start to feel pretty empty or directionless, and um, we all find things to channel our interests into, and some of them are more productive than others. So it's like you really kind of want to think carefully about what uh, what attracts your attention and your interest and your intensity.
Yeah, I think you know you've found something you love when the effort it takes just feels second nature. And I think you, at least for me personally, I think that happens pretty quickly, or you're able to recognize that pretty quickly. And that's something that I find really interesting about your writing when it comes to endurance. You use phrases like sense of effort, perception of effort, perceived exertion, rather than simply just saying effort or exertion. Why is it important to understand effort with that interpretive type of language?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing there, or the key thing that I'm trying to highlight, is that it's not set in stone, that it is a subjective uh, perception. Because if you accept that effort is just a thing, it's an objective fact, which is, I think, what my mindset would have been throughout my competitive career, because I had never thought about this stuff. That if in the third lap of a mile it feels like it feels this hard, that's just how hard the third lap of a mile feels. Whereas when you start thinking about, the subjective perception of how hard it feels, you realize, oh, it was feeling really hard, but maybe that's in part because I was expecting it to feel hard, or because I was scared or whatever. And there are that there's no like there is no effort meter that you can clamp onto someone's brain and say, well, yeah, that's how hard you were feeling. And effort and pain are two different things, but pain is there's a similar conversation to be had about pain, where it's like, I can, if I can apply a burn to your skin and I can tell you how hot the metal is or whatever, like that was 100 degrees and that was 200 degrees, but you can't measure how it feels. And different people, pain is a fundamentally subjective sensation, and effort is too. And so, um, it's a subtle point, but I think it's like, I think it's kind of the central one. I think what you're picking up on there is probably the most important realization that I had in sort of trying to understand the science of endurance.
Another interesting point about perception, and it goes to your personal makeup as a person, which is that you're colorblind. I'm curious to know how that has played into your life with endurance, just with like the perception and sight. Would be curious to know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I mean, fortunately, it hasn't meant that I've gotten run over while running through a red light by accident on a run. Yeah, no, it's it. So, I, yeah, I haven't really thought about the parallels, but um, when you grow up colorblind, you definitely understand that perception is subjective. That what what I see is not what everyone else sees. Uh, it can be a pain in the neck when you're dealing with, even just like reading scientific papers. It's like, okay, here's a graph with the lines are six different
Mm.
colors. I have no freaking idea which line is which, and so if you don't give me dashes and dots or whatever, I can't read the graph. And similar with displays on computers and stuff like that. So that's a minor frustration, but I think on a deeper level, there is an understanding that and even leaving aside colorblindness, I read an article recently. I can't remember where it was. That was talking about color perception, and talking about there was a new study that where they're picking up they were doing brain scans of people looking at different colors and starting to pick up signatures of uh, what goes on in the brain when you perceive red versus blue versus yellow, and making the point that it's like, okay, on a given person, we can repeatedly then say, we can do a brain scan and then we can tell that person's looking at red right now. But you can't judge it from person to person because the brain signatures are different. And going, which gets to this deeper point that we actually don't know for sure that what I see as red is what you see as red, or that we experience the same visual sensation, even leaving aside that I'm colorblind, where we know that I'm not seeing the same stuff as everyone else. But even within people who are not defective like me, um, that perception is subjective, and that's a, like you said, that's the goes back to this. You understand that's true about colors. You understand it's true about a lot of other things like effort and pain.
There's this interesting passage from your book that stood out to me. You say, "You may have the greatest endurance in the world, but if you're an incurable optimist who can't resist starting out at a sprint, or a coward who always sets off at a jog, your race times will never accurately reflect what you're physically capable of." How does identity, you think, play into endurance and almost like a nature versus nurture perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, so what I was talking about there is this idea of pacing, that when we talk about endurance, it's never just you know a measure of capacity. It's a measure, like there's not just like this guy has 28 quarts of endurance. It, how you perform fundamentally depends on how you judge your effort, how well you judge your effort, and how deep you're willing to push. And it took, so I guess I to draw on my own experience, I always prided myself on being a very smart racer. That I didn't get caught up with emotion. It's like if you go to cross country races around the world, um, everyone goes out so fast. Everyone runs the first mile at an insane pace, and there is the logic behind it is like, oh, it's really crowded at the beginning. If you get stuck behind 100 people, you're going to do a lot of effort. But so everyone, like, let's say people are going to average 6 minutes a mile for a cross country race. Most of them will go out at like 5 minutes for the first mile and then just be hanging on for dear life. And I would say, you people are all idiots. I know what I'm capable of running for whatever the distance of the race is, let's say 5 miles. So I'm going to set it at that pace because that is physiologically optimal. And so I had this construct in my head of the smart racer who is doing things better, doing things the right way. And it was only kind of toward the end of my career, and then in retrospect, when I started to get into the science of it, I sort of made this very obvious, this realization that should have been very obvious, which is that if you think you can run 5 minutes per mile, then you start 2 steps into the race, you're running 5 minutes per mile pace. You've already created a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have already kind of made it unlikely or almost impossible that you're going to run 450 per mile that day, because you've decided what you're going to run right from the start. And so, and as you know, so as an endurance athlete, I spent a lot of time racing against Kenyan athletes who have for the last 30 or 40 years been absolutely dominant. It's maybe a little more complicated now, but certainly when I was racing in the 90s and early 2000s, the Kenyans were the best in the world. And there were a lot of Kenyans who would come over to North America and run road races just trying to make a living, even, winning $100 or $200 a weekend. And there was a characteristic way that these Kenyan road racers tended to race, which was they would just go with the leaders. No matter who was there, no matter how fast it was, they would try and stick with the leaders for as long as they could. And then, typically, unless they were the best, they would start fading. And someone like me, who had gone out more slowly, would gradually reel some, but not all of them in. And it took me a long time to understand. It's like, so I was racing in a cautious way so that I was maximizing my chances of having a good race, but minimizing my chances of having a great race. Whereas some of these other runners, they had a different perspective because they were trying to make a living. They were trying to survive. So to them, it's like they wanted to come first, second, or third. And if they weren't first, second, or third, they didn't care. They could come 100th because the prize money 0 for fourth and prize money 0 for 100th was the same for them. So they were running all out. And as a result, they had a lot of crappy races, but they had some amazing races, far better than I could ever dream of, because they were willing to take chances. So that was kind of an epiphany, understanding that races aren't just this sort of pure, simple measure of your capacity, that, as you said, your identity, how you think about what you're capable of, uh, right from the moment of the starting gun is influencing the outcome. And so your willingness to take risks, your willingness to have a bad race is going to dictate your chances of having a great race. And that's something I've tried to keep in mind, uh, even outside of running, because I think that the same thing is true. It's like you, you're not going to achieve everything you set out to, but it's very unlikely you're going to achieve substantially more than you set out to, right? Like you have to be willing to swing for the fences sometimes.
You talked about how the biggest change that you would have made to your running career is that you would have invested more of yourself into motivational self-talk training. What exactly do you think that training would have looked like?
Yeah, and I'll broaden that to say that I would have taken sports psychology seriously, because
Yep.
motivational self talk is one element of that, which is essentially trying to change your internal monologue so that when the going gets tough, which it always does, our default mode is to say, "This really sucks. Why am I doing this pointless sport? I should be an accountant." Um, and so, but that's a self fulfilling prophecy. If you're like, "This is so hard," then as your brain is evaluating all the signals from your heart, from your lungs, from your legs, from it's also taking into account that your this other part of your brain is saying it's really hard, and so you're judging. I'd better slow down, as opposed to if you're saying, "This is what it's like. I'm ready for this. Everyone else is feeling this too, so I can keep pushing." You're more likely to keep pushing. So I think motivational self talk is probably the easiest to understand and um, the most widely applicable type of sports psychology work. And in terms of what it looks like, it's a question of thinking carefully about what are what are the thoughts that go through your head naturally, which ones of those are problematic, and what could you replace them with, and would what would work for you, because there's no, like, you look through you listen to other people's mantras sometimes and you're like, oh God, that's so cringy. I could never say that to myself. I would never take that seriously. So you have to figure out what's reasonable for you, and then you have to practice it, right? You can't just drop a list of what you want to say to yourself and expect it to pop into your head halfway through a race. You need to be practicing it in training and in races. So that's one thing I do. But just more broadly, I think I would take seriously the role of the mind. So for me, I would say one of my when I was racing well, my superpower was that I could push hard and dig deep and really rise to the occasion. The bigger the race, the better I tended to perform. But there were also times in my career where I I got too far onto the side of on the wrong side of the curve of being psyched up, and I was just pathologically nervous. I can remember, going to some meets in Europe, and one of the veterans of the team, who was, a multiple Olympian, was like, "Alex, God, it's exhausting rooming with you because you're so nervous. You just make everyone else in the room nervous." And and I heard him, but I didn't change. I didn't know how to change that. And I think probably working with a sports psychologist would have helped me to, recontextualize what am I here for? What are the stakes? Like, what happens if I don't race well? Life goes on. Like, so there were other aspects of my mental preparation that I think I could have done a lot better at, and um that I just didn't know it was something that was changeable in a sort of controllable and repeatable way.
I had Steven Kotler on my show. Not you, do you know who Steven is?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, flow state expert. I'm curious to know, and this is tying into the pain component as well, about how people in an odd way could almost be enjoy the pain or, become addicted to the pain in a way. Do you see endurance, or could like we make the case that endurance is just like an extreme case of flow state?
I think when it's going well, it absolutely is. I think um, so. There's a difference between what you can do in training and what you can do in racing. if I were to go out to the track and run a mile as hard as I could, just by myself on a Tuesday night or whatever, it's radically different from what I could do in a competitive race where the stakes matter. To the point that, like, when you're in workouts, if you don't want to think about it too much, because you're like, so I just did 10 times a quarter mile slower than my goal mile pace, and I was taking 2 minutes of rest after each one. There's no way I'll be able to. Like, you just feel like I just went as hard as I could, and I couldn't even do a quarter of my race distance at that pace. So there's this mystery, or this magic that happens in the course of competition. I think flow state is maybe one way of expressing what is different. That you have to be able to enter an altered state. It's not just that you're trying harder in the race. There's more to it. Flow is one of those things that for me, it's like sports psychology, in the sense that I read it and it makes sense and it feels familiar. Um, the research behind it is not as satisfying as that I would like it. Like, the quantifiable side of me is like, okay, so can't we like measure this? Can't we can't we check these parameters? And but as a sort of qualitative description of what it feels like to be pushing hard and pushing beyond what you might have thought was possible, I think flow state is a great way of thinking about it, and it identifies some of the conditions. Like, you need to be trying to do something that's hard, that's near the limits of what you're capable of, but not beyond them. Like, you can't, if you can lift 100 pounds, you can't. There's no point in trying to lift 500 pounds. It's not interesting to try and lift 50 pounds. You need to try and lift 105 pounds, right? Like, you need to be pushing yourself. And so that's a good example. That's one of the hallmark preconditions of flow, is this kind of barely manageable challenge. And I think that's a great way of thinking about what a good race feels like, that you're right at the edge of your capacity.
I find it interesting that you say that the research doesn't feel, fully satisfying for you. And you talk about how things can sound plausible, but plausibility isn't the same as proof. I'm curious to know, within your work and your curiosities, are there any hypotheses that you have, but you don't necessarily attach yourself to because you don't fully have proof?
I mean, I would go so far as to say that uh, all of all of modern cognitive science, that's not really fair. Like, there's a fundamental problem with, let's say, sports psychology, which is that you can't do a placebo-controlled, blinded or double-blinded trial. Like, let's say you teach one group to do self-talk, and you don't teach the other group, and then you switch them around to do a crossover trial. That first group can't unlearn self-talk. You can't take away what you've already taught them, so you can never do a crossover trial. So it's not that scientists are stupid or too lazy to test these ideas. It's just that we're talking about ideas that are very hard to test in a way that fits with my, like, from physics quantifiable mind. But in terms of, like, theory, so there's a theory that's sort of ascendant in cognitive science right now, called predictive processing, or it's sometimes called or related to an idea called the free energy principle. The fundamental idea there is that everything that's going on, that our brain's fundamental job is to predict what it's gonna see or sense in the world, and that our senses, that we're not just like a sort of big TV camera that's looking around and recording what's going on in the world. We're predicting what's going on in the world, and we use our senses to check that, yes, that's, I expect to see a monitor on my desk. There's still a monitor on my desk. And so, but fundamentally, all of the world is being generated as a prediction in the brain. And this has a lot of implications for how the brain works, what goes wrong in mental health conditions. It's also about how we think about endurance, because endurance is fundamentally a predictive process. Going back to what we were talking about earlier about pacing, that when you run a marathon, you don't just sprint as hard as you can and then slow down gradually. It's fundamentally, you're predicting what you think you can run. And so having those predictions slightly off, if the predictions are too conservative, you're limiting your performance. And I think as a general rule, anyway, predictive processing is a complicated topic, which I will not try to explain in one answer. But what I will say is, you read the ideas of predictive processing, and I find it a very plausible explanation for how the brain is constructed and how the brain works. Um, you talk to skeptics, and they point out, it's like, where's the evidence? Like, that's one way of explaining it. And it's just like in physics. It's like string theory has beautiful mathematics, but critics would argue that it's like unfalsifiable, that there's other ways of explaining it too. And just because you can come up with an explanation that fits the facts doesn't mean that's the right explanation. So string physics is super complicated. Predictive processing, I think there's ways of testing this stuff. And I think in the next decade, we're going to see more rigorous tests of this idea that, if it pans out, is going to be the new kind of grand theory of how the brain works.
I would assume that your physics background, and that's where your real academic foundation, you've really been able to leverage that as a writer from the standpoint of just holding yourself to a high standard. Not that, writers in general don't hold themselves to a high standard, but just going to that standpoint of, you came in to writing from a very different viewpoint than I would say most writers are. Um, and you've talked about on the journalism side, which I find really interesting, is that in the past, when it comes to science journalism, uh, writers can become so focused on the audience where you almost try to reverse engineer the writing process of, like, okay, what does the audience want, or what do we need to be putting out there, um, rather than just being solely focused on, like, okay, let me be a writer here. And I'm curious to know, how do you balance that out between, I guess, following your own intuitions and curiosities and writing for yourself to a degree, versus also knowing, okay, I am writing for other people?
Yeah, so a couple of good questions in there. First, I'll say about the physics. I, I've used my physics knowledge surprisingly infrequently. Like, I have not had to be like, oh, I understand. Occasionally there's stuff in physiology where it's like, oh, you really have to understand conservation of energy, or momentum, or whatever, or like biomechanics, maybe even more so, like forces and torques. For the most part, I think it actually um, goes back to like mindset and identity, in the sense that I went through physics. Physics was super hard, and required some, serious. You had to have serious mathematical chops. You had to be willing to read very hard things and struggle with hard ideas. And so my identity, the way I like to think of myself is, I can read hard papers. It's fine. Like, and I can read, and I'm not daunted if I read a paper and I don't understand half of it. I'll read it again, and then I'll talk to the scientists, and I won't just like say, I'll ask them to explain it to me, because I'm confident that if I work at it, I can get it. And so I'm really trying to understand what's going on, as opposed to just reading the abstract or taking the press release. And look, there are lots of journalists who do that extremely well without having gone through physics. But for me, I think that's where physics gave me the mindset and the confidence to say, I'm going to try and understand what I write about. Like, I'm really going to, read the whole paper, which is yeah, I don't want to throw it. Yeah, I don't want to sound dismissive, but it's like, it is definitely possible to write papers based on reading the abstracts. And sometimes you can tell that that's what's happened. In terms of writing for the audience versus writing, yeah, like, it's a tension. It's a constant tension. Like, are you trying to write what people want to hear? Or are you trying to write what you want to say, or you think is important to say? I think to some degree it's an important tension, because so occasionally I think, like, hey, maybe I should do a Substack. Then I can just write whatever the hell I want. I don't have to convince an editor that it's interesting. And that sounds like heaven in some ways, but I also know that my editors, at all the publications I've written for, they play an important role in kind of reining in self-indulgence. It's like, if you let writers just write only what they want. Some of them will produce brilliant stuff, I'm sure, but as a whole, you will get a lot of self-indulgent stuff. It'll be like you'll be trending towards 100% memoir. Everything is like, let me tell you about this cool thing that happened to me when I was 12. And I love telling those stories, which is why I need an editor to say, Alex, maybe we don't need this story about when you're 12. Why don't you just tell us about the study? It's like, but it was a great story. So, I think the worst excesses on one side are that you're doing like the the Google analysis to what are people searching these days? Let's write an article with those 7 search terms. And that is awful, awful, awful. The results of that are terrible. But there is, even though I like to imagine that, it would be great to have no constraints, on being at least conscious of like, well, what do people care about? What do people want to know? And how do they want to be told this? So I guess another example of that would be my sort of default mode of discourse would be like, hey, I read this really interesting study. I'm going to tell you what's in the study, and I'm going to go through the 4 key figures in the study and explain what those figures are. And for some fraction of the world, that's like, hey, that's great. We're just getting the information, semi-digested and spit into our mouths. Like, wonderful. But a lot of other people are going to be like, whoa, that's boring and impenetrable. But if you make me understand why it matters by starting with a story or by framing it around an anecdote or something like that, then I'm going to be into it. And so I definitely lean towards, I have a lot less, like if I write about hydration for running, I'm not going to be like 34-year-old Bob Smith used to like to run without drinking. Now he started drinking and he really likes it. And here's a study that explains why. Like I just, that's not my thing. I don't do that. But when you're writing about complicated topics, if you can illustrate it from a real world, so I try to force myself, and that's an example of me trying to think of how will readers want to grapple with this information. They will like to see it come alive with a real story. And so I do that even if my default would be like, I'm just going to post 4 graphs and tell you what's in the graphs.
It's a lot easier said than done, I think, the way that you write, the way that you balance the research and the substantive with also the personal and really drawing people in. It's a
I
different
appreciate that. Thank you.
it's a difficult subject matter. I mean, yeah, you could get deep into the weeds, uh, and it seems like you're able to balance it pretty well.
And again, back to your original point about like trying to anticipate what readers want, and then again to what I was saying about editors, it's like, yeah, I still, I've been doing this for a long time now, but well, I'll have conversations with my editors, and I'll be like, look at this great study, and sometimes they'll be like, yeah, I don't think that's gonna like fly for this audience, and sometimes I'm disappointed, and sometimes I think it's the wrong call. Like, sometimes I'll push back and say, like, put me in, coach, I can do it. I think this is complicated, but I think I can explain this. And other times I'll be like, yeah, fair enough. This is going to be this is going to be heavy sledding or it's going to be uninteresting or hard to make. But it's definitely those are contexts where it's helpful to have someone pushing back against you sometimes. And maybe this is a good opportunity to shout out. David Epstein is one of my uh, mentors and someone I really admire. He has a book coming out next year called Inside the Box. I haven't read it yet, but it's all about how constraints can foster
Mm.
creativity. So that taking away, this idea that if people would just let me do what I wanted and let me be who I am, that I would be maximally creative and productive. What I understand about David's book is that it's kind of pushing back against that idea and saying that no, sometimes it is helpful to be like, no, if you're going to write this poem and it's going to have 5 syllables on the first line and 7 syllables on the second line and 5 on the third line, and you're going to write a better poem because of those constraints. And so I think in that sense, I certainly like having an editor who will, I'd rather have the editor say, Alex, that story is boring than write the article and have, 10,000 people out there going, God, this is boring.
Do you think an education on endurance can yield better physical outcomes? Like, do you think if somebody were to hypothetically read your book and okay, now I have a base understanding and knowledge on endurance and I'm more mindful on this, it'll yield better physical outcomes.
Absolutely. If you buy my book, I guarantee 6% improvement, 100%. Now, let me give a slightly more nuanced answer. I, I think it can be a double-edged sword. And I'll quote David Epstein again, who he once wrote something along the lines of, just because you're a bird doesn't mean you're an ornithologist. So, and I think the context he was saying that is like, look, just because you can, dunk from the foul line doesn't mean you can explain to other people or understand why you're able to dunk from the foul line or why you're able to do these. Like, in a lot of cases, athletes are gifted in ways that they may have difficulty articulating to others and even to themselves. But it goes the other way too. Just because you're an ornithologist doesn't mean you're a bird, and you can know everything about a topic and still be terrible at it. And so I've had this sort of internal debate or conversation with other people over a long time. It's like, is it helpful to be, an uber nerd about the sport, to be really fascinated with it? And I think there are times that it can get in the way, that there's a benefit to just being like, no, I go out there and I do it, and I rely on my coach to tell me when to train. And of course I have my own thoughts, but I'm not like hyper obsessed with looking up, trying to understand the physiology of electron transfer in the muscle cell or whatever. I do think that it, I'm about to say, I do think that reading my book will be helpful. I do think that there's things.
The reason why I brought that up though is because that is the thought that I had when I was reading your book. I was like, oh, I think this could potentially benefit me physically.
I'm super psyched to hear that. And I think it's true. I think one of the main criticisms I got about Endure, or not criticisms, but like feedbacks like, oh, really interesting information. I really wish you'd had more on how to apply this in practice. And, my response to that was like, yeah, me too. Like, I wish I knew how to apply it. But I think, so
I'm gonna
first
be
of all,
your
that's
big.
just,
I'm gonna be your biggest hype man here,
yeah,
basically. But
that's perfect. Yeah, yeah.
but I feel
6%,
like
that's what I promise.
at least from my case, I feel like the knowledge itself is the application.
That's the argument that I would make, that it's like, yeah, look, sure, I wish I could give you 10 exercises, mental exercises to do or whatever. And there are people who will do that. My more focus is on where's the evidence at. And I really do feel that knowing that, I feel like the knowledge, the big ball of knowledge that's encapsulated in that book, had I had that when I was an athlete, I think I would have had a different perspective on what my abilities were. And so I look back, my best event was the 1500 meters, which is basically like a mile. And, I raced the 1500 for like a decade. My best time was 3:42. Never once in that decade did I ever go through the halfway mark faster. I never went through the halfway mark faster than 3:45 pace. And so then I was able to pick it up sometimes on my best races, but I never took the chance of going through at 3:40 pace to see what would happen. And I think that's the kind of thing that I would have thought more carefully about had I had a sort of not just a not just the sort of scientific knowledge, but had I been thinking through these questions more deeply about what defines our limits and how do we determine what pace we set out at, and then what will force me to slow down on that third lap? Is it going to be because I have, lactic acid bubbling out of my ears, or is it going to be because it's hard and I'm full of, my mind is full of doubts, and I'm worried that I'll slow down in the last lap, so I'm slowing down prematurely. So I do think it helps, but I also would say, as a guy who gets into the minutia, I've interacted with a lot of athletes who have questions and who my diagnosis would be, man, you're too into the minutia. You're worrying about the details too much. You're showing up and your coach is saying, do 8 by a kilometer with a minute and a half rest. And you're saying, I don't know. Shouldn't the physiology? I read a study that said that 2 minutes rest is better. So shouldn't we do 6 by K with 2 minutes instead of 8 with 1.5? And it's like it can become a source of anxiety. This sort of belief that you can optimize every detail, whereas in fact you're losing more by fretting about it than you would gain by micro
Mm.
adjusting the workout. So I think there's a balance. I think knowledge is good, but not letting it, but keeping its importance in context and not letting it start to drive the bus.
Yeah, allowed to supplement your process rather than becoming the entire process. Are there any big questions that you feel like continue to drive your work forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier this idea of predictive processing, and I think that's the most hopeful avenue I see. So when I wrote Endure, there were two kind of main theories that I highlighted on how the brain defines performance. This idea of a central governor that's protecting us from really emptying the well, or what was called the psychobiological theory, which is this idea fundamentally that it's just about how you feel. It's that effort is the master switch. And if you feel it's too hard, you'll slow down. And so learning how to adjust effort was the key goal. Both of those are sort of interesting perspectives that I think capture truth. And if you push far enough, I think they end up kind of being very similar, like saying the same things, but they don't actually explain how the brain works or how, in the context of endurance. Um, and so I think that's a big open question because to really be able to, you know, manipulate's maybe too strong a word, but to be able to kind of take advantage of and um, learn how to influence how your brain is controlling you. The more we know about how it actually works, the better. And so I think there's when as I mentioned, I think this idea of predictive processing is going to get more rigorous testing over the years to come. And actually, I wrote an article last year saying I think predictive processing has potential to explain some of these questions or to in a better way. And I think it's only a matter of time um, before we start seeing people trying to explain endurance and the limits of endurance in this context. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here, but a couple months ago there was a paper came out explicitly trying to use predictive processing to explain endurance. And of course, if the paper came out last month, that means they've been working on it long before I ever thought about it. But so this it's starting, and that's a modeling paper, and they sort of suggested here are some things that we need to test to see if this is true. Here's some ways we could start to um, examine this. This is one of the, this is a classic example. I was mentioning earlier about some ideas that are kind of hard to explain, and you don't know whether it's going to be something that an audience is going to be interested in. And and I would say I think like when I wrote that article saying predictive processing might explain endurance, it didn't make a lot of a splash. I didn't get a lot of people um, connecting with it. So I think there's potential for interesting science to come out of it. And I think from a journalistic perspective, I think there's a fun challenge there, which is this is what people in cognitive science think of as like the big idea of this generation potentially. How can I explain that? How can I bring that out in a way that is accessible but captures what's cool about it? And I'm sitting here talking to you, doing a really absolutely crappy job and expressing what it is that's special about it. But I hope over the coming years, I can find ways of. I mean, part of it is if you can't explain something well, it's a sign that you don't understand it well, and that is absolutely the case here. I don't understand the theory well, but hopefully there's potential to get better.
That's an endurance test in itself, it seems like, when it becomes, for your writing career.
Yeah, this is not something that I'm going to sit down next week and be like, I'm going to explain predictive processing in a way that is going to be accessible to people. No, this is something that maybe the 10th time I write about it, I'll I'll find a way or a metaphor or a framing that is that captures it in a way that's more interesting or more accessible or something like that.
I want to end off by sharing a little anecdote, and I think it ties in nicely with that. Something that you posted on Instagram a few months ago. You were, I guess, you were driving your daughter, I think, to sports practice, and you make a wrong turn, um, and you say and she wants you to, use Waze, and you say the ubiquity of GPS felt emblematic of a deeper shift in how we interact with the world and with each other these days. More passive, more automatic, more forgettable. I wanted to chart my own path and make my own mistakes. And it feels like the way that you were just talking right there about your writing and that journey seems very synonymous with that. But it also just feels like your journey is almost like this is like a microcosm for that. I mean, like starting out as a runner, getting deep within the world of academia and physics, and then transitioning into being a writer, a very winding road, you could say. And I think, especially younger people, I think people need an appreciation for that, where, obviously you can understand the body as a machine, but just like life as a role, it's not going to be a mechanistic sort of linear path. So I have true appreciation that you promote that winding path of your life as well.
Well, thanks, and I hope it doesn't lead anybody astray. But I guess what I would say is the leaps and the turns that I've made, I'm happy with them all. Like I don't regret having spent 10 years as a physicist or whatever. But what enables that, what makes that possible, is that each of those times, it wasn't like I only want to be a journalist if it goes exactly according to my plan and I'm make it and do the things that I dreamt of. What made journalism feel satisfying right from the start, right from when I was in journalism school, there was a sense that this is the right thing, was that even if I end up doing something completely different, not even if I end up writing about accounting, which is when I started as a freelancer, I was writing for an accounting magazine, going to accounting conferences. That's fine. That was the fun of trying to chart a path was satisfying on its own, independent of the goal. And like it's one of the ultimate cliches about enjoy the journey rather than the destination. But I think that is what makes a winding path possible. If you're not same with running. Like, look, I wanted to make the Olympics. Believe me, I really, really, really wanted to make the Olympics, and I didn't. I didn't even come particularly close, but it was an awesome journey, and so I have no regrets about it. And so that is what I would encourage people to look for, is things that are just fun to pursue, where there is a goal that you care about, but it's whether you make it or not is not going to be the ultimate determinant as to whether you thought it was a good journey.
Alex, I think that's a great place to end. Where can people go to learn more about you, your work, anything else you'd want to plug?
Well, big thanks for the conversation, Tim. This has been it's been fun going in some unexpected directions. A metaphor for the things we were talking about. I have a website, alexhutchinson.net. It's got links to various social media places and where recent articles. I write for Outside about once a week. I have a new article on a new topic in sports science. But yeah, you can find links from alexhutchinson.net.
Awesome. Great talking with you today.
Okay, thanks, Tim.